Bam.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Weiss, and you're watching the Break It Down show.
We are having an interesting conversation. Will Riley is going to join us, and thanks to Will for helping set this up. I love that we get to have these heady conversations. Joe Rogan, Eric Weinstein, sit across and have these things. They brought in a non-PhD person who had these brilliant ideas, and he's an actor. Like, what does he know? And so they have these incredible conversations. We're doing something similar here today, where we're talking about bones and what we think they mean, and people bringing their own stuff into the bones conversation. So I guess just as we start here, Elizabeth, and everybody should look into her background. You can find all kinds of stories about everything, but how do you wash out your own stuff, but also allow your stuff and your creativity to inform how you might look at something that we just know so little about, and yet we know so many things about these things?
Well, my area of expertise is really looking at skeletal remains, and most specifically, human remains. And so one of the things that I've been doing throughout my career is looking at skeletal remains in three main ways. And I'm what most people would either call like an osteologist, a study of bones, or a bioarchaeologist, someone who looks at the skeletal remains in the archaeological settings. And I do this by looking at three main types of research, all using skeletal remains or x-rays of the bones, CT scans, but it basically revolves around three main themes. One is that, can we use these remains to reconstruct the past? What were these people's lives like? What did they do? How did they engage with each other? Was there evidence of trauma, for example? So that's one of the issues I look at. The other issue I look at is what things were biological as opposed to cultural. So trying to determine, when we're looking at bones, whether something it relates to aging and therefore affects everybody if they get old enough, or relates to the culture that they were in and therefore would only affect one people's. And so that's kind of looking at bone biology that is interwoven with looking at disease patterns. So, for example, if you're looking at activity patterns, you can look at arthritis, so degenerative joint disease, and figure out by looking at populations from thousands of years ago to now, what things were similar throughout time and what were different. And that can help you understand the biological aspects of aging and degenerative bone disease, but also can help you understand what it was culturally specific and therefore may be related to overuse of certain parts of the body, and therefore help you reconstruct the past. And then I also look at skeletal remains of what I call like case studies, where I'm looking at specific individuals to try to understand, what caused their specific ailment or their specific variant. And all of this stuff is grounded in a love of anatomy, understanding the form and function of the skeleton, but also how muscles attach to those bones, how we move, and how things go awry sometimes. And a love of comparative anatomy that is also in line with our understanding of human and non-human evolution, to understand, what similarities we see biologically within our species and across them.
When you do, all this cross-disciplinary stuff that brings in a variety of things that you have to have a mastery of. You've got to know the literature. It's amazing to me that you all can keep up, or maybe you just keep the windows so tight that it's easy to maintain. You know everybody. You can go out of the conferences and stuff, but it is a constant swim where you're always having to go, well, what did someone write? Like you must You must be fascinated by the bright star discovery and all of those bones and everything that's going on there and how that's changing everybody's work. So I guess I want to go back to part of that complex question I wanted to start with is, how do you keep your stuff, your ideology, your religion, your beliefs? Like, look, if I was to jump into the PhD stream and get a PhD in anthropology, I believe that humans have been moving around on water as long as they've damn seen water. Like, they just figure it out either by accident or whatever. And so, yeah, there's people moving in boats. Now, I can't prove that scientifically. I can't prove it academically, but that's where my premise would be, is like, I know people have moved. Let me go see how my premise survives.
So basically, one of the things is I really do think that you have to let the data lead your conclusions. And anthropology is such a fascinating field because there's new data all the time and new, um, tests of old data all the time. One of the things I used to tell my students when teaching, just an introductory class to human evolution, for example, is that when I graduated with my bachelor in 1996, there were far fewer species around of uh, early humans, and we so we've added something like half a dozen species since 1996, and we pushed back the fossil record from about 3.5 million to 7 million. And so it makes it always exciting. And I truly love the field of anthropology, whether it's looking at human evolution or the Paleo Indians, um, the peopling of the Americas, and partly because the data is always being refreshed with new finds. Um, I think it's important to stay humble and accept when some of your beliefs or some of your hopes have not borne fruit, or that you've been wrong. And this is the trademark, I think, of a good scientist, is to accept that sometimes you are wrong. But the
Yeah.
other thing is not to have a strong opinion on everything. So, for example, with the peopling of the Americas, we've had some really exciting finds, such as the mammoth bones that have some cut marks on, and perhaps some footprints that have been dated to very old. So 22,000 years old. But then there was questions about the dating technique that was used, and maybe it's not as valid as possible, and other people are not as convinced about the mammoth cut marks as others. And so my position is, I don't know with the validity of these. I have opinions on them, and I'm kind of still on the fence there. But basically,
Hmm.
I would love to see uh, human skeletal remains 25,000 years or older in the U.S., um, found on North American continent. But if it's not found, I'll just have to stay on the fence and say, well, the best data right now is a much younger. That's the best data. So, maybe 14,000. I think the oldest skeletal remain, the oldest Paleo Indian, I believe, is about 12,000. So we need another, like, to double that to get to 25,000. But I think that that's part of the joy of science, and a part of the joy of anthropology is this ever-changing data set.
Welcome to the show to Will Riley. Thanks, friend, for coming on. I appreciate you, and thanks for setting this up. We're kind of getting started in talking about, how do you wash out your own bias and the collection of any kind of academic endeavor, because it's easy to lose sight of that and get wrapped up in something and have these huge fights internally. You're a political scientist, and some things ossify, and then someone breaks that calcification, and you guys are all forced to deal with a new reality, and it makes folks mad. They get really mad, right? Because they bet their whole lives on these things. And there is, I would say, a religious aspect to this, where it becomes a dogma, and we always say these things. But how do we fight that? I guess, Will, how do we fight that academically if we're publishing and we're trying to work, and something external comes in and starts to pollute our ability to actually do our job and ferret out what is important in academia and what is not. There you go. I got you.
Okay, yeah, fair enough. So I think there are two different questions there, actually. Like when you're talking about academic kind of ossification, like people getting really stuck in their theories, I mean, I think what you do there is just what political science and anthropology both did pretty well for a while. You have a norm around the idea that science isn't like one set of ideas you have at one time. It's these sort of tools and techniques that you use to figure out things. So, I mean, like almost all of the great scientists, like Galileo, I mean, the classic stereotype is that the Catholic Church killed him. And it's a little more complicated than that. But almost all of the truly great scientists were thought of as complete fucking cranks for a while. Basically, like in their own lives, many were completely rejected. Even today, there are ideas like anything that culturalism, as it's called, the groups differ in terms of behaviors for a bunch of reasons, genetic hereditarianism. I mean, there are whole paradigms in science that are basically considered evil. And I don't necessarily think that'll be the case in 100 years when you have more Chinese publications and so on. So, I mean, in science, normally you've just had a norm of, well, if you can argue for something, then you can publish that and people can try to prove you wrong. I mean, I personally think there have been humans around in the fully modern sense for a lot longer than we think. Like, I would agree that there have probably been people in the Americas for 25,000 years or more. But I mean, I also think that humans have risen to the point of civilization at different times of the past and destroyed ourselves. If you look at like tectonic dispersion around the world, like there's fused glass under the ground in certain places and so on. I don't have any proof of that, though, so that's not really science. But the basic idea is, you know, you advance your argument, and if it's good, people have to recognize it and they have to cite it and respond to it. What Dr. Weiss in the latest book, I think, points out is that right now you have a lot of things from wokeness, which is the big one. It's the elephant in the room. But to political pressure, even on the right in some states, like should creationism be taught in textbooks? You have these external forces that are kind of going into science and saying that certain things are completely off limits. And that's actually harder to respond to. I mean, I think that what you have to have there is people in kind of the external surrounding society that almost protect science. You're gonna, in states like Florida, for example, they're doing things like taking out the diversity and political statements from college job applications that a lot of departments had put in there. So, I mean, obviously, if you want to restrict who can speak, one thing you might do is limit participation in your profession only to people that agree with kind of prevailing dogma. And so that's then going to be the dogma, the rule for a long time. That's what the church did, actually. That's where the word dogma comes from. So hopefully we can get around that.
Yeah. Do you want to expand it all on that, Elizabeth?
Yeah, I think that Will is right on in the sense of, you know, there's this ossification or this stagnation in the fields, and oftentimes that's surrounding certain topics which are taboo now. And the way to get rid of that is to invite people into your field that have different perspectives and that have don't mind challenging these taboos. And another aspect of it is, I think that in anthropology, what we sometimes have is, and you see this in other fields, but anthropology is supposed to be the study of the other, whether that is the study of the past or the study of another culture. And yes, you might see similarities between you and others, but it's still the study of the other. And I feel like, I think that with anthropology, what's happened now is that people are viewing that their data, the other, through their biased lens or their self lens. And that's why you get these things like queer anthropology, um, the anthropology of women and things like that. I can't think of anything more boring to study than myself, So, and yet that's what everybody seems to be wanting to do. And you also have moved away from looking at data to looking at yourself, and you'll get ridiculous articles with super small sample sizes or actually no sample. There's a type of anthropology now called the anthropology of self. This is not anthropology anymore then. And so I think that in order to avoid this kind of you know stagnation in the field, we need people who are interested once again in the original intent of the field, and that is to understand the world around us, not just to understand the world within you.
When I wrote my paper, we put it into a cultural journal because there was multifaceted where we could find a place to put it. And I was being critical of Americans working abroad in conflict zones and trying to empower women for a variety of reasons. And we went to, and look, I've got a lot of direct experience with this. This is a qualitative piece of work, but I have access to the ground in a unique way. I have an academic partner who helped me put it all together. And so it's all legitimate work. The rebuttals would start before I finished the title of the paper. And I did this partly because you want to have a provocative paper. And so I would get these things where like, women are empowered. And I'm like, it's the title. Have you read the abstract? Like, no. Okay. So we're just talking about, and then it was who's women, us, them, together, and it was this bad because they have this big white dude saying, hey, it's inappropriate. They didn't even know, they didn't care what the position was, but ultimately it was, it's inappropriate to go to some other person's land and start to tell their women what they need to do without doing the work to be culturally appropriate. And that shouldn't shock anybody in the anthropology world, that you can't just export our problems and a solution for that problem to other people in a conflict zone and then profess to be part of the do no harm crew, And so it is interesting. And this is not about me, but I'm just painting a paper like, you have this thing where we're so passionate about women. We're so passionate about that as a topic. We can't even slow down and get past the title before the fight starts.
Yeah. And it's quite interesting, sometimes the weird, ironic, and hypocritical things that arise in academia. On my new book on the Warpath, My Battles with Indians, Pretendians, and Woke Warriors, I talk about the issue of feminism in anthropology and how, you have some very progressive people who are who engage in some very, what I would consider extreme sexist behavior because the Native Americans are for the sex discrimination, such as in menstrual taboos, not allowing menstruating women to engage in field school with others around them, or not allowing women to hold certain artifacts because those are only meant to be held by men. In these cases where it's happening in an academic setting, it's actually appropriate for the anthropologists to try to reach out to those people of another culture and explain why it's not okay to engage in sexism, because in that sense we're being the educators, and there I would say it is appropriate to correct these types of things. But yet the woke warriors in the academic halls instead kowtow to such actions and really are taking a step back in women's rights when they do so.
Well,
all right. Yeah, one of the things there that comes up in terms of what Elizabeth just said actually is the idea, like in Western social science, it's generally accepted for some weird reason that you're supposed to think of our culture as always being wrong, which has interesting implications because almost every other culture is worse along pretty much every metric that woke people claim to care about. So, I mean, this comes up with the great native tribes. It comes up with Arabs. It comes up in India. Like, the idea of women's rights to the modern level was really a Western thing. Feminism began with upper middle class 1950s housewives in the USA. So you'll see people that deeply and passionately believe these things come into conflict with other societies that don't, and immediately abandon them. Which is someone who's a right-wing male writer, I think is pretty funny, but is also extremely negative to some extent. I mean, I think everyone accepts that women's rights are good to a certain extent in the USA. But I mean, to me, I think the basic underlying issue here is the idea that really comes out of Marxism, but that underlines all critical theory, which is that the only thing that can sort of cause gaps in performance is oppression. So if the West is outperforming other groups of people, those people have to be oppressed. And whatever an oppressed person says has to be correct. So if you're dealing with some barbarian chief in the jungle, as most people would have traditionally thought about this, who says, well, when she bleeds, she cannot eat at the table, you now understand that they believe this because of terrible things we've done to them or something. And that has to be accepted until something magically changes it. It's a weird philosophy when you encounter it. But as a final comment, I think a lot of this obviously does come out of the fact that academia is just so imbalanced politically. I mean, either of you guys might correct this, but it's like 93 to 94% left-leaning the last time I looked at the data. And I mean, there's a famous idea, the attitudinal model, that people tend to think things that accord with their own political and racial and so on background. I find that to be true. So conservatives tend to be originalists in the law and so on. And I mean, if everyone is to the left of Castro, and I assume anthropology would be one of the most left-leaning in these disciplines, 58 to 1 or something like that. Then, yeah, the idea, like, radical feminism is actually a perfectly coherent idea. I've dated radical feminists, although not for long. But I mean, it's traditionally in a population, 5% of people would believe that. And those people would be on the extreme left. And then you'd kind of transmigrate over to the extreme right, where you'd have your traditional Latin Mass Catholics and so on. And these people argue and dispute, and that's why it's fun to go to coffee houses. But if all you have are the people over here, it actually does become a problem, because you're getting a really narrow range of the human ideas.
Yeah, I think one of the studies that looked at the political leanings of anthropologists actually found 0 conservative anthropologists, and looking at like 60 different universities. It's a Lee Jessam study, I believe. So it's just like crazy.
Shouldn't that shock
so
the academics? I mean, if you truly are about diversity, why does it stop at political thought? And like, why wouldn't that make you appalled? Like, what are we doing? We can't be in this political echo chamber and write professional papers. How do we I don't think that's good for anybody to have that much singularity. I mean, I love unity, right? Unity is a good thing, but too much diversity is a bad thing. So how do you balance that a little bit?
I'm not sure that you can balance it. I'm not for like political litmus tests to increase diversity either. I think what you need to do is you need to find people who truly love the field for the field and not for ideological reasons. I think that is the key. So, if you Google my name, you'll find like some people think I'm right wing. Some people look at me and they're like, "Oh no, she's a liberal who got mug type," and there's all sorts of like weird ideas about where I lie on the political spectrum. And the thing is that none of that, regardless of where you think I am, it really didn't shape my research, because my research was based on what I saw on the bones, because I love anthropology and I love anatomy. So my political leanings shouldn't be reflected in my research. And I think that becomes more difficult for people who choose political science. But I would suspect that the best political science professor would be one who's like, yeah, I don't care who wins. I don't want to vote. I'm just curious about all these political animals out there. That would be like the most objective. But then why would you go into that field, right? Whereas in anthropology, you can see where it could work that way, as long as you get someone who's really has that desire for knowledge about the past, or about the human evolution, or forensic anthropology and so forth. that does not necessarily tie into their religious or political beliefs.
When you leave a tenured position because of the conflict at San Jose State, and you love the thing that you do, are you now just free to do whatever you want within that world? I mean, you still have a license to, it doesn't take away your PhD, right? You're just like, I'm not going to work here anymore. So you can do whatever you want, and now you really can. I mean, access is one thing, but someone will give you access. So are you stronger now than ever before because you're not beholden to anybody's rules?
I do think that I'm stronger now because I am an emeritus professor, so I still have I still have the privileges of a professor in that sense. Um, when I left San Jose, one of the things is that I had always thought to myself, if I don't have a collection to study, I don't want to stay. And basically that's what happened, right? So fortunately, I was retirement age as well. So it made the settlement a little bit easier. But basically, I am still conducting research. I am still actively looking for skeletal collections to study, but I also have data of my own that I haven't been able to analyze yet. And one of the things that happened in San Jose that I've written about both in my new book and in other articles is that the university told me that I'm not allowed to even use data I've previously collected. And this was just one step too far.
Right.
If you look at some of the California universities, like Cal State Bakersfield, I believe is one of them, they're going down the same road. And some of them are not even allowing professors to use slides for classes that have images of Native American remains, or certain artifacts. So this is going to in a real terrible direction, and censorship direction that is really burying science. And I hope by being able to talk about this and write about it and search for other collections, that I'll be able to continue conducting research. Unfortunately, there are other roadblocks in the way, such as journals who are starting to censor people's ability to publish by saying, well, if you don't have permission from this tribe to publish this, then we don't want it. And that's a whole nother hurdle to jump over.
Yeah, if I could ask a question about this. So when did the entire idea that it's sort of taboo to conduct anthropological work with, for example, skeletons that were found dozens of years ago, or artifacts that aren't really linked to any particular modern tribe, begin? Like, what is that something that had a grassroots origin, like American Indian movement or something, or did that come strictly out of the universities?
It has both. There's a couple of big events that happened that leads us to this point.
Yeah.
One is that the American Indian movement was part of that. So like late 70s is the other thing is that there was an excavation in where both Native American and non-Native American remains were discovered.
Mm-hmm.
And the non-Native American remains, the European American remains, were reburied, and the Native American remains were not, and that this caused a very big backlash. And the Native American activists basically said, we want our ancestral bones to be reburied too. Now, I don't disagree with the fact that this was a bad decision to rebury one group and not the other. I think that they actually shouldn't have reburied any of them. So my thing is, like, I do think that was a wrong call to say, well, we'll rebury these and not these, but I think they should have said, we're not going to rebury any of them. I think that would have taken a lot of the argument away. But then in late 80s, it's like 89, the Smithsonian went forth and had a repatriation law put in place. And then in 1990, we get the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which was a compromise a compromise to try to allow research to continue on collections that were not culturally affiliated, not linked to any modern tribe. But what happened was when remains started being discovered that were much older than a linkage to any tribe, like Kennewick Man at 8,500 years old, or Spirit Cave Man is about 9,000, then what happened was basically we get the Native American activists who want to claim those Paleo Indians as well. And this kind of made NAGPRA, grow or spread to include non-affiliated remains, and the only affiliation is that's really used then, or used for the reburial and repatriation, is the oral myths. And so we get this movement to say, well, oral tradition is as acceptable of a piece of evidence as as scientific evidence, and it just isn't. But this is how we get to this place where almost everything is now taboo to study. It's this increasing emphasis on oral myth creation stories from the Native Americans, basically.
Yeah, one thing that you just brought up there, this was the most surprising thing to me, and I'm sure Pete has a series of questions after this. This is the most surprising thing to me about the book. A lot of these laws require people like government officials and serious scientists and so on to treat basically Native American creation myths as though they were real. Like, is that correct? Like, our people have been here by the shining laughing water as long as the grass has grown and so on. Like, how do you distinguish among these? And is there any check whatsoever on whether or not these are valid? I mean, I would assume science sometimes knows that the Comanche, for example, came down from the north and beat the Apache. Like, how is that reality treated versus the legend?
Well, the legends usually just are just legends and myths, and include all sorts of supernatural beings and creation myths from the bottom of the Grand Canyon or so forth. And they were started to be used initially as evidence of their creation myth is is based on the location, and that shows evidence of the connection, the geographical location. But it's gotten much wider, much more lenient in usage. And basically, the last changes in NAGPRA and California's version, CalNAGPRA, says that if there is a disagreement between the science and the Native American creation myth, then the Native American creation myth takes precedent over the science. So it's like taking the Bible's Adam and Eve story literally. I'm not against people studying religions. I think it's quite interesting, but not as a literal science, right? And one of the things that I've said many times is that religion shouldn't intrude into science. That doesn't mean that there might not be some religious tales that have some grain of truth, but you'd have to look at it in a way that you strip out all the supernatural stuff, strip out all the anachronisms like coyotes running steamboats, right? Things like that, and see what's left over. And then what you find is that not much is left over at all, and it oftentimes does not cohere with the science. But because repatriation and reburial laws are really about atoning for past sins and about postmodernism, it doesn't matter if they're true. What matters is that it's a Native American story that we're listening to, and we're going to believe the victim regardless of its validity. And that is one of my big criticisms about repatriation and reburial.
Yeah, and I mean, like, it strikes me, and this is the last thing I'll say for a while, but it strikes me that there's a deep human truth to a lot of these stories. I mean, even the biblical stories, like in Babel, essentially diversity causes linguistic conflict. Like, you know, Cain and Abel, or the herder and the farmer fighting. We won't get into like her dripping fruit tempted him and all that. But I mean, like, there's an underlying reality there that's not actually, like, there wasn't actually a garden in Iraq that was full of talking snakes that led man astray. That's a metaphor about the uses of violence and sexuality and so on. Like Coyote, I actually like Coyote. Coyote's my favorite deistic being after Athena.
Me too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, like, Coyote is the trickster god that guides you to war against a stronger opponent. So it's not much surprise that the Coyote legends proliferated even more after the whites came. And I mean, the natives held out with their arms intact for 400 years. I mean, so, you know, apparently the big guy gave some useful advice. But like, Coyote's not real. I mean,
Right.
it's like, so there's a serious problem if someone is saying, well, based on a 23andMe style genetic analysis, your people arrived here as conquerors in 1750, and you say, well, no, a talking dog told me we've always been here. I think that's where religion becomes an impediment to the development of science. So that to me is just fascinating that we're now required that the very sophisticated, you know, the quantitative and feminist and so on academic types who would, you know, read the Christian Bible at most sardonically are taking the stories of, you know, Coyote old man literally, which is entertaining.
Yes. Yeah.
What do you think, Pete?
Oh, well, I was just going to say we should make sure we plug Elizabeth's book. We are here talking to Elizabeth Weiss, and she's written this incredible book, and I'm going to pull the title up because it's longer than just On the Warpath. On the Warpath sounds sexy and cool, but it's On the Warpath, My Battles with Indians, Pretendians, and Woke Warriors. It is available on Amazon at the link that I'm going to put up right down here below. And you know what I always say, buddy read, buy two, and read it with a friend and compare notes and see what you come up with in terms of, you know, when you have these other things that get in the way of academia, how do we deal with it? You know, I look at, I used to live in Chicago. Will's from Chicago. You can go to churches where the gravestones are smooth or basically illegible. You can't read even what's there. There's no one going there doing anything with these graves. At some point, you know, someone might dig these folks up and study them for some reason or another. And would we lose our minds about that? Are these our modern Indians in a Catholic or an Episcopalian sense? Would we tolerate that, or would we have the same problem and have activists from the various religions that inhabit Chicago from 150, 200 years ago going crazy and causing the same kind of ruckus?
I think that's quite an interesting question. And in the past, I would have said, I don't think that we will have the same problems, but I'm not so sure anymore, because repatriation and reburial ideology has left Native American studies and anthropology and has moved out of it. And just recently, for example, there was a huge reburial of Berlin, from a Berlin cemetery that was, I think, hundreds of years old. I can't remember the exact date. And they studied the remains and then they reburied them. And my thing is like, why? Why would you rebury them? And my mother's German. And I told her about this story and we talked about it. And she said, it's not very German of them to rebury them. So, you know, she was just like, she could not understand why that would be done in Germany. And I think it's because there's this new narrative that regardless of whether it's Native American or not, but that bodies need to be in the ground and not seen. And so you have, for example, the Smithsonian has decided that all human skeletal remains on display will be removed from display, and they have been, but also that even photos of skeletal remains will only be shown if they have a consent form. back to 350 years. Well, that's the beginning of photography. So basically they're saying that no photo of skeletal remains can be shown that's older than, unless you have a consent form, right? From the beginning of when camera was invented, you have to think that consent forms came like maybe 200 years later. But those people who were trapped in that non-consent form era still should have given a consent form. This is an absurdity. But it's an absurdity that is ruining our museums, making them much less interesting, robbing young people of the excitement of seeing something real. Skeletal remains and photos of skeletal remains are not models, they're not replicas, they are real in the sense that you see so much more detail and variation than you ever would with just a model. And this teaches kids, and I'm talking about literally kids now, because they're often the ones who are going to museums with their school or family. It teaches kids several things. One thing is it shows that not every death is sad. Not every example of a death is a sad thing. It's a very different thing to, if you know someone and they die and you're grieving that loss, because you're not grieving the bones, you're grieving the person. But these people are, a person who died 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago, that's the grieving process is over. But the other thing is you're teaching them that human variation is beyond skin deep, that things like differences between individuals, whether it comes to the sutures on their skulls or the shape of their eye sockets, that this is very unique for each individual. And when a child sees these kinds of things and starts to grasp it, that may be evidence of a person who would be interested in studying some of this stuff, whether a forensic anthropologist or a medical doctor, and you're stoking that imagination and the bringing alive the wonder of the past and of anthropology in general. And that's what they're snuffing out, basically, by, whether it's reburying European remains or hiding photos of skeletons that are 300 years old.
This is just a public service announcement. I have Microsoft Word, and I am authorized through my own personal policy that I wrote myself to write anyone a permission slip for anything. So you just ask me, and I'll just get in there and I'll type whatever you need, and it'll be signed by me, and then you'll have permission to do whatever it is you need. So often it's just a silly piece of paper sometimes that someone looks at like, well, it must be legitimate. Pete's allowed to do that, and we often get tied up about things that are policies, but it's like, I don't have that policy. The hospital will tell me like, oh, it's in your portal. I don't have a portal. I'm like, oh no, and you can do it on your phone. I'm like, well, you didn't do a portal access request form for me for my phone, and I've got a policy against these things. So you'll have to have someone call me. All this we get wrapped up so heavily in the permission slip that we need to do these things to show a fucking slide of some bones. Come on. I mean, this is ridiculous when we talk about the things that we need to do. And if we're not going to take academia seriously, then get out of it and let the real academics do this stuff. It boggles the mind to think about all the things that we put in front of the very thing that we're trying to do. And this is a little bit of an anecdote, but and we all have been in these things. We'll do the meeting, and then everybody will introduce them. Hi, I'm Pete. He, him. I live on Carkeen land. That's where I am right now. I do this show. The Carkines were here, and I'm so sorry. And I hate Laura Ingalls Wilder. Ooh, I hate her. and then you can go on to the next person, and it's just this performative, dogmatic pantomime of something that has nothing to do with the real thing that you're trying to deal with. And we have real problems. And whatever we're going to deal with, we can't have all these things stacked up and all this, waltzing around to try to say, hey, look, I can waltz. I can do all these things. let's just get to the work of the real hard work, because anthropology is not easy. And and one of the reasons why we don't know enough is that we don't have enough money to dig down in this spot or dig down in this spot, and it takes a lifetime. I got a chance to go to Saqqara and a bunch of other sites in Egypt, and at the time there was the very last couple of months of this French either archaeologist or anthropologist who was working. He's like 100 years old, still working. His whole life was just this one little quadrant of dirt. He knew everything about it. He was digging. We need people like that who dedicate their lives to it, so we can understand this one little space better, and then give that person the time to go through their notes and write things. Let's not put a bunch of performative things in front of it. All right, Pete, rant over. Out of the way.
I actually lived for a year in Egypt from 1995 to 96, my last year as an undergraduate. And then after that, I went to Kenya for 2 months in field school, Kubifora Field School in Kenya, which is on the close to Lake Turkana. And one of the interesting things about Egypt is, there's so much, right? There's so much to study still. There's finding things every season. Like there's still, pyramids that they haven't found, right? Which is one of the amazing things. But, another aspect is that at least for much of history, Egypt has embraced the study of the past and has displayed mummies, has been so proactive in allowing their archaeology to be studied, written about, shown. And I think that it would be a real shame if that ever ended. People might say, well, it's their ancestors. But we know that, for example, a lot of Egyptians are not related to the pharaonic Egyptians, that there were invasions into Egypt. That's the way how Egypt is now Muslim, right? So that's another aspect. But ironically, although a lot of the narrative has been, oh, well, these are not your ancestors, or how would you feel if they were your ancestors, or the descendant community should be able to make the decision. When it comes to other examples of skeletal remains and of research of skeletal remains, Americans have not been allowed to make the decisions about their descendants. A good example of that is in the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian Museum had an exhibit on, I believe it was a Jamestown exhibit, that looked at the remains, and they did a kind of a bioarchaeology overlapping with forensics to look at those remains. And it was called Written in Bone. And they had a companion piece online that was also called Written in Bone. It was to be used for, high school, junior high school lessons, to get students interested in forensics, interested in bone biology and so forth. And it was a great online tool, and they've removed it. And if you go to that website now, there's an apology, about a 4-page apology saying, thank you for your interest, but. And the but that they have is basically saying, we've decided that it's no longer okay to show these remains because they didn't have permission from those individuals. However, they even say this on the website, that the descendant communities, the ancestors, were for the research, were for the exhibit, and were for the online exhibit. So they weren't allowed to make the choice because the do-gooders in charge at the Smithsonian decided that they knew better. And this is just an absurdity that is spreading, where people who are what I would call, in part, the left-wing academia and scholarship, progressive left, or they basically are making decisions on what you can see, based on what they think is moral, or not offensive or ethical, and that it doesn't matter to them whether you have a link to that people or not. So for all the talk of, oh, we have to include the descendant communities, only some descendant communities voices are worthy of being heard. And I think that goes back to, when you said, when you're introducing yourself and people say, my name's Elizabeth, and then they give their pronouns, and then they give their description. And in anthropology conferences, this is now very common. And I don't think that they're doing this for some sight impaired person in the audience. They're not doing it for somebody who's blind. What they're doing it for, because in some ways, if I'm going to talk about the ancient Egyptians, what does it matter that I have red hair? Right? And so they're doing it to signal who you should listen to. So if I get up there and I say, I'm Elizabeth Weiss, I'm white with red hair, wearing a lilac shirt or whatever, then people say, well, you know what? We don't have to pay so much attention to her because she's a white person. Next person comes up and says, my name is so-and-so. I'm a Native American. It's like, this is a person you have to pay attention to. And that's a real reason why we have these kind of virtue signaling introductions, to signal who you're supposed to listen to and who can be ignored.
Okay, that's a really good point. I think the virtue signaling goes deeper even than that, to some extent. And yeah, I think it's all about showing who you are to kind of your compadres. Like none of it's actually about communicating to the blind or something like that. At one of my disciplines events, this had gone on for a while, and I actually asked if anyone there was blind before giving my description. And I'm a man standing here in a gray suit with white stripes and so on. And obviously no one was. And no one was like non-binary either. This was a panel on military science that was almost all guys that were over like 30. So it's the whole point. A friend of mine studies Renaissance literature. And she was once telling me all these crazy phrases that were used in courting, some of which were implicitly very witty or even sexual. But like, I have my special perfume behind my ears. Just like all of this kind of nonsense that would indicate interest in going for a walk with you or dating you or whatever the equivalent was. And the catch was that if you were a man of the lower orders, like you didn't know what that meant, you just missed the signal. You would indicate that you weren't in the group that should be dating this person, and you would be passed up. And that's what I think all these linguistic tricks are to some extent. You guys have already said a lot of this. But like, you're not actually helping out blind people in the audience because there aren't any. What you're doing is showing that you're a left-wing member of the upper middle class because you know the proper way to address an audience that's full of blind people. And it's that almost all of this trickery goes along the same lines. And it goes beyond this, actually. Like the idea that you shouldn't say colored, which is what everyone's grandmother says of any race. You should say like person of color, which is the exact same thing. It's just an easy, obvious example. Or that you shouldn't say retarded for someone with mental problems. That's literally the Greek word for made slow. Instead, you should say badly delayed, which is the English word for made slow. Like, you're not doing anything moral here. You're not avoiding using harmful terms like cracker, insult for women or something. You're just showing you know what's up. And as a former working class kid, I actually found this to be a real problem in interview processes for top law firms and so on. Like, I picked it up rapidly. But one of the things you're being tested on is how much of this sort of which fork to the left goes with chicken kind of nonsense that you know. So I think that's a really good point. Like, of course, none of this is actually done to help people. Land acknowledgements may be the ultimate example of this, actually, because what a land acknowledgement actually means is screw you, we won the war. So, I mean, it's not like, would we say in Illinois or something, this is Peoria land? No, it's not anymore. I mean, the tribe fought very bravely. They still have a representation in the local schools. They're 4% or whatever. But I mean, they're not going to take it back. They all own farms now. They're growing, old world crops that we brought over here. So the point is, if anything, cruel and mocking. but it's presented in this signaling symbolic way that shows your social class. And a last point that ends with a question. There's not only a huge level of class and so on to all this, there's also a bizarre element of presentism, which is what underlies like all of this stuff. Like when people say like Thomas Jefferson and Shaka Zulu were rapists that should have been prosecuted, like by who? I mean, you're assuming that this entire system that we recognize existed in Zulu or even primitive American society, or that those people would have been considered bad by the societies that they were great leaders of in that time. You're making assumptions that are just nonsensical based on who you are today. But so, I mean, like, just as a very simple lead into this stuff with the Native Americans, what their ancestors would have wanted. Did Native Americans practice burial? Like, I genuinely don't know. Did they have any of these traditions?
Not all of them did. Some of them specifically did not. And I think it's presentism, but I also think that it's ethnocentrism to say, all bodies should be buried. There's, many ways that bodies have been treated in the past and present by many different cultures. And so one of the things that, I used to teach a class on mummies, and we'd go through all the different types of mummies throughout the world. And one of the things I try to always tell my students is, don't judge how other people treated the dead in the past. This is, something that a type of presentism and a type of ethnocentrism. But I also think, presentism is a huge problem in anthropology and academia in general, whether it's, saying, oh, well, Charles Darwin was a sexist, or, about slaveholding, about, the definition of rape and the definition of child abuse. And that doesn't mean that some people weren't progressive, but what I think is fantastic is that, inch by inch, humans did progress and realized, oh my goodness, I know that it was always okay to treat children like this, but it's not a good idea, and moved forward. So, at one point, in the past, slavery was kind of a global phenomena, and we've gotten away from that for the most part. It's one of the things that humans should be proud of, that we've almost completely eliminated it. Not completely, but that we've made such huge progress on it, as opposed to trying to, punish people for their ancestors' owning of slaves, or a culture that had slaves at this point versus another point. I mean, Muslim culture, Islamic culture had slavery to a huge extent. I don't think that doesn't mean that I think that the Middle Easterners now should try to atone for that. I think we should deal with learning about the past for the past's sake, and also putting things in perspective of how far we've come, but also put in perspective of how there's not just one bad culture, or one bad group. That there's everybody has been wronged and has wronged at some point. Yeah. So that aspect, but also to say, isn't it wonderful how much progress we have made? And that is often lost in the narrative.
Yeah, that's an extremely good point. I mean, I think either I or Pete was about to point out they still have a ton of slavery in the Arab, Muslim, and Black world today. I mean, countries like Mauritania.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a 3-part conflict between the Bedouin, the Muslims, people that are basically white, and people that are basically black, and all of them enslave each other after battles, but they also all enslave like the indigenous sort of black inhabitants. I mean, and that was just kind of the world until pretty recently. You had the black tribe, the Berber tribe, and the white tribe, and if you lost a battle, you'd spend 20 years or the rest of your life, depending on local practices, improving the agricultural productivity of some worthless land owned by your victorious opponent. So yeah, we got past that, and that's a thing to be very proud of. It also, just very briefly, like, we judge the past, and we sometimes forget that, one, people in the past would judge us too, and two, people in the future are going to judge us. Like, when I think about our society, like, I mean, we put pigs, which have an IQ of 50, in these concentrated animal farming environments because we're too lazy to grow them on farms. Or they look like Buddhist hell if you've ever seen a video of one. I'm personally very sex positive, but I mean, there are 3 million women and men that are active prostitutes on OnlyFans just in the USA. Like, what percentage of young people is that? How would George Washington or Martin Luther King react to that? I mean, this was a crime until quite recently. We have sun bomb nuclear weapons that could blow up the damn planet. So, I mean, I think when people look back at us and they say, well, these 40-year-old human male leaders had codes that would allow them to destroy the world, I mean, people will start crossing themselves and saying, my God, what a terrible idea that was. So for us today to think that we have reached the apex of history, there's actually, I mean, I enjoy the guy. He's a great political scientist, but there's actually that book, The End of History. I mean, come on. Like, no, they're going 200 years. They're going to be very different people in a more Islamized or feminist or a cyborg, whatever it is, society, looking back at us and saying, good God, they didn't know what they were doing. They were all overweight and they were walking around with guns on them. I mean, so I think it's important to realize that. Like, the society with the 3 million young prostitutes calling George Washington's society insufficiently gentlemanly. I don't know if the founder was convinced by that. Like,
it's just to kind of take what you're saying, the slave thing. I'm glad you covered that, Will, because that needs saying. We haven't whipped that. We haven't whipped, especially in the Arab world, the touching of young kids. It's very culturally accepted in a lot of places, and so ding, ding, ding. You want to go fix a problem? You want to go jump into someone's world and force them to compel a certain behavior? That might be a place to start. And I guess the other thing is at some point we're going to all realize that we don't realize all the things that we don't know. And I love that show on PBS when they do a person's DNA, and like the ultimate comeuppance is Angela Davis. Like, hey, by the way, one of your ancestors came across on the Mayflower, and you got people in your family tree that have owned slaves. So, ta-da! Your whole world, your whole being has been altered by just simply looking back 2, 3, 4, 5 generations. And it turns out that we're all, like everybody knows, if you're saying, we all come from things that are bad. We all come from things that are good. We can all just work on what we're working on. And when we get into these performative things, I just, I'd rather just get to work. And I appreciate you, Elizabeth, trying to get out there and just get to work. We don't need less access to information. We need to let you go do your thing and figure out how you can teach us what you've learned, and then have 1,000 more of you all working on these disciplines so that we can actually advance that stuff and not have you in court fighting the California state system. I'm glad that they settled with you, and fuck those guys for even putting you in that position. But we need more work from you all rather than having to go out and fight ideologies. I don't know what it is in the, I hate to say the woke world, but the folks who struggle with this stuff, like, if you're going to look at all of these things, like if you look at the religious side of things, there's exegesis, when you study the words of the Bible, and there's the historical Jesus, and there's rules to these things. If you want to go do these things, apply those rules to your magic person and get to work and publish. But if you're not going to do the work, then leave me alone and don't assign me problems that aren't my problems, because it sounds like you know how to keep yourself busy, Elizabeth, and I appreciate you for all the things that you do.
Thank you. And the funny thing is, some people might see me as combative, but I'm actually really not. And if I could have just spent my entire career just looking at skeletal remains laying low, but I've always been concerned about the loss of data and about repatriation and reburial. And it wasn't really until very recently in 2020 that I saw the connections between repatriation and reburial of Native American remains and all of these other things that basically constitute the woke world, so to speak, or the academic woke world. And I was like, I hadn't really made that connection that the repatriation and reburial issue is just a sliver of the other problems in academia, which is another reason why I wrote my book, is because I think that not everybody sees all these connections. And once you see them, you can't unsee them. It's so clear why repatriation and reburial of bones is also linked to the issue of the sex binary and the trans issue, and is also linked to, the identity politics of citational justice, where you're supposed to cite people just because of their skin color. And these are all tied in this kind of web of wokeness. And that's what really surprised me in a way when I published my previous book, Repatriation and Erasing the Past, in 2020, was that it hadn't really sunk in until then.
Will?
No, I don't have any sort of really witty final comments. I mean, thanks. I enjoyed the book. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you. And one of the things is that I went with Academica Press, who this press is one that saved Jim Flynn's book on censorship in academia. And Jim Flynn is a psychologist who looked at the rise in IQ, and he was like, super liberal, and yet he wrote a book about censorship in academia, and then it got censored. Well, and Academica Press came in and rescued the book from not being published, and that's really why, or what drew my attention to Academica Press, and they've done a fantastic job getting it out quickly, and I think a very nice production of it for reasonable price. So I'm very happy with how they've worked on it, and I thank them for their courage.
Yeah, thank you to Academica Press. Well, Will, unless you have anything else to say, I'm going to run the credits here. But thank you both for coming on the show. Will, anything else?
One very quick comment on Jim Flynn, if I can.
Yes.
Yeah, please. Yeah, I love talking about Jim Flynn.
Yeah, we're always ready for a Jim Flynn moment on this show. But no, Jim Flynn actually, I've obviously read his work. I'm a culturalist rather than a hereditarian when it comes to group IQ. I don't think there are Eastern European or African countries that have an average IQ of 55 realistically. It's an ongoing debate with no one on either side is evil. But so Jim Flynn is a guy who pointed out that IQ scores are increasing globally. Maybe not in terms of what's called G-factor IQ, but if you take the number of questions that a white or black American got correct on an IQ test in 2002, that back when we started serious IQ testing in the 50s would have given you a score for the African-American guy of 102. So when you say that the norm in the USA right now is a bit under 100, we have to remember that we keep adjusting the score upward so that 100 is always average, no matter how many questions people are getting correct. So blacks, most of the white ethnic groups, I think Puerto Ricans weren't for some reason, but almost everyone would be pretty smart by the standards of the group that started IQ testing, who are hardly fools. I mean, these were our great hero fathers in the 50s. So Flynn's making this point, look, if you study, so on, you can change IQ, a healthier diet and environment, all that. But because it's so taboo to talk about IQ at all, Wikipedia and even the major encyclopedias censored most of the pages on race and IQ recently. I actually helped get most of the information back, so now most of it's back again. But to take out not just the hereditarian stuff, there might be a genetic role here, Charles Murray would say there probably is, but also the stuff from Jim Flynn where he's saying, no, Murray is wrong and I can prove it, because he was referring to the bad men, if that makes sense, because he was talking about the concept at all. So it's just a blank space where Chuck Murray had been, James Flynn had been, it was all gone. Wow. And it was the craziest example of censorship I've ever seen. And a bunch of young scientists on all sides of this debate, actually, like I said, restored it. People went back to the Wayback Machine and were this is crazy. But that's an example of the extent to which information is manipulated behind the scenes. Who would ever expect that to happen to the James Flynn Encyclopedia Britannica or Wikipedia page? Well, nobody. And that's why it happens. And you look at it, if we hadn't noticed it, if you looked at it 6 months later, you would just think, well, I feel like there was more here. But this is the encyclopedia. Yeah. I guess there wasn't. And then you would have gone on with your life.
Yeah.
This is a big point, too. And we need that conversation between Chuck Murray and his I can't remember his name now, the guy who passed on, they write this book. It changes how we see these things. And then Flynn comes along and says, let me work at this. And he does. And it's this long-term conversation that we're still having. And as we try to struggle with these things, and maybe 20 years down the line, it'll be like, look at those adorable little guys. Or maybe it will be this really big moment like Niels Bohr and Einstein throwing blows academically and trying to figure out if free will even exists, and we find out that turns out there's just not a lot of evidence that you're completely free and that we're more connected. These weren't ideas that you could process in the early 1900s. And so getting rid of these conversations doesn't do us any good, because the next academician that comes along is like, oh, I can develop a test for that, and finding that gap between heredity and culture and see where we're at, right? Because there's all kinds of work to do, and we don't know what the answers are, but we sure as hell won't know if we're going to put a bunch of bones back in the ground and erase a bunch of Wikipedia pages. Let's have a little bit of courage that the folks who are licensed to go work in this area can go out and do it, and they don't have to spend their time genuflecting and waltzing around just to get a seat at the table. That shit drives me crazy. Sorry, I'm ranting again, but it makes me a little bit crazy. All right, so anything else that you want to say, Will, before we wrap this up?
No, I think that pretty much says it all. I mean, science is a cumulative process that goes on over time, but it stops going on if for some period of time you just rebury all the bones and take all the text out of the encyclopedia. Then a new generation has to start anew. That's almost the definition of barbarism. You can avoid that.
Them damn barbers. All right. Elizabeth, I'm really going to give you the final word.
Speaking some bitches. But, I mean, the term is a useful one. Like, a savage is a wild human being. A barbarian has crops and animals. And a civilized person has law and has a tradition that you can pass forward, which is what we're talking about here.
And if you think about it, if you think about the term vandal and vandalism, that's the Germanic Vandals. And, we don't want to get rid of that term because it's linked to a particular culture and peoples. So that's another term, vandal. Yeah. And
we sure as hell don't like the Cleveland Indians, but we're okay with the San Diego Padres. It's a bunch of fat Spanish friars.
They're literally dressed up like priests. I mean, this is actually, I mean, we can't do another 20 minutes on this, but this, when the Native American tribal names dispute was going on, a buddy of mine who's a Chicago Irishman actually put together a list of all the offensive team names. And it included the U Chicago Maroons. A Maroon is a runaway slave warrior. And they used to have like a big black guy with a bow. It included like the Fighting Irishman. It's literally an Irish guy knuckling up. The Vikings, the Pirates. And nobody cared at all except for the 4 Indian teams. So, I mean, it's kind of like there's a documentary about The Simpsons called The Problem with Apu. This is actually a great metaphor for the woke left. The Problem with Apu makes the point that Apu is a racist, stereotypical character who represents a minority. And he should thus go away. That's it. That's the whole documentary. It's like 2 hours of this with like woke Indian women complaining and so on. And the director is actually a pretty good filmmaker, but the topic is idiotic. But what he misses is that every character on The Simpsons is an ethnic stereotype. Like you have groundskeeper Willie, who's an angry, drunken Scotsman. You have like a fat mob boss called Overweight Tony. I mean, you have the black doctor is Bill Cosby from the Huxtables. I mean, so it's just
the cop is a fucking pig.
I mean, it's literally like a round Irish guy with a pig-looking face. I mean, it's like all of them are complete stereotypes. They have a retarded kid or whatever kid delayed, Wiggum, But so this guy looked at this whole world of cultural curated stereotypes and picked the stereotype for his group and was like, now that is unacceptable. And that really describes a lot of what we're seeing today. Like Irish people could easily be as obnoxious about American history as anyone but Indians. They could be right up there with black people. They're just not. Chinese Americans easily could be. They were the slave labor that built the railroads. We've just forgotten that because they're the 3rd most successful group in the country. So there's a key element of free choice in the present modern world here.
Yeah. I have long been a thing with the team names. Like you would never call a team the Jews, and I'm like, how about the Saints, the Gales, the Celtics, the Padres, all these different team names? Like, that argument doesn't work at all. And
isn't there in fact
I like Indians.
No, but isn't there in fact a Triple A team called the Rabbis, like in Scarsdale or someplace? Like
there has to be. There has to be.
No, there is. Like,
yeah.
But so it's just. I didn't want to interrupt you there, but it's just like objectively false. Like you'd never call a team the Black Slave Rebels. Well, yeah, we have one. You'd never call a team the Fighting Whites. Well, we've got one. I mean, it's like teams are named after scary things that you used to fight.
Yeah.
That's why there are the Tigers, the Indian Warriors. Like you're not going to represent your area with like the Bluebirds.
Yeah. Anyhow, it's just these things don't hold up, and yet they take away names. All right, so for reals, I'm going to roll the credits here. Thank you both so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly. Thank you.